Hello everyone, welcome to Canteen Cup. My name is Scott, and how is everybody today? First, I want to start off with a big thank you for everybody that has joined my channel. I am grateful for you guys showing up, and I am very thankful to have you with me. I hope I'm going to put out some good content, and we are going to delve a little bit deeper into the communications world. A few things. Terry, this is for you. Uh, and in looking back through some of the comments on Patreon and in Pastor Joe's, on Pastor Joe's Viking Preparedness channel, there was some mention of, costs of being a ham radio operator. And yes, there is some costs involved. And you and your crew have to recognize that there are costs involved in communications, and how you mitigate that depends on you or your crew. If you've got a guy that's going to be your comms guy and he's investing a good amount of money into the equipment so that you can communicate, then you maybe need to adjust some of your other SOPs. For example, maybe he doesn't have to have a high dollar rifle or even have a rifle. Maybe what he needs is a shotgun and a pistol instead of an AR-15 with 20 mags and 10,000 rounds of ammunition, because that is amateur radio equipment. While you can, if you shop around, get it fairly cheaply, there's still a cost there. And really what I'm saying is that you kind of need to equalize that out. It's just like whoever is on your medical staff. If you have them buying bandages and tourniquets and band-aids and ointments and concoctions and potions and lotions and whatever, then you also can't expect them to have full battle rattle, so to speak, with them. I'm one of those guys. I do not have a complete set of gear. I have enough, and my responsibility is to provide communications for my crew, both on a local level and on a regional and a national level. It is a specialized skill set, and when you're forming your crew, you all need to figure out how that's going to happen. Typically, the comm specialist or the comm sergeant supplies his own equipment, and you have to give up some costs some other place, so that when you're forming your crew, when you're talking about this, for lack of better words, you have to come up with something that's fair. In other words, you can't burden a guy, or you shouldn't burden a guy who buys all this comms equipment and then expect them to spend another large sum of money for, we'll call it full battle rattle or whatever else that you're doing for your crew. It kind of has to be balanced out a little bit, and that's all I'm really going to say about that. So thank you all for joining me, and today we're going to talk about some of the duties of a communications specialist or a communications sergeant. Sometimes we call them a comms specialist, or your comms guy, your communications guy. And he's got some very important roles, and you need to understand those. And in this video, I'm talking to the comm specialist or to the prospective comm specialist if you feel this is where you want to go. But I'm also talking to the crew leaders, the team leaders, people that are actually running the show, that they have to understand that this is not just a radio. I think when I was out at Shofar Mountain talking to Pastor Joe, he gave a really excellent example of a rather myopic view of comms, and it's nothing against what he was saying, but it's just something that the way people look at it. But it was a great example. And what Pastor Joe was saying was that when he was in Special Forces as a detachment leader, his involvement with communications was when they were out in the field, he took his hand behind him to where his radio telephone operator or RTO was, and he said battalion. And what he was waiting for was for that comm specialist to get battalion on the radio and then hand him the handset, and then he would talk. And I think in today's world, a lot of that is true, and it translates into the preparedness community that as a leader, you expect to, say, I want to talk to, Joe Snuffy in the team. And then once the communications guy, uses his magic and gets it, he hands the headset to the leader who then talks. So understand that there's a lot that goes on after that. There's a lot that happens between when you say who you want to talk to and you getting that person and then getting the microphone and actually talking to that person. So I want to lay out some of the duties of a communication specialist, and this is a specialized field. It takes specialized training and it takes practice. So let's start off with the basics here. And one is the comms specialist, and I'm going to kind of separate the two people out. You have three groups of people in the communications. You have the comm specialist or the comm sergeant. In special forces, that would be an 18 Echo, and your comm specialist should have equivalent expertise in communications to an 18 Echo, and maybe even a little more, because in special forces, you're dealing with military. You have military equipment, and there's kind of a finite ways to communicate. Whereas when we get into the civilian world, it's not that our equipment is better or worse, because the military equipment is built more ruggedly, but we have far more options. And so you have to have, at a minimum, your communication specialist, your comm sergeant, whatever you want to call them, has to have roughly the same knowledge as an 18 Echo. And when I'm saying that, I'm saying as far as the expertise in communications. Now, SF groups, SF detachments are all cross-trained and everything, and that's great, but that's their full-time job. But at a minimum, your comms guy should have that level of expertise as far as communications is concerned. He also has to maintain that equipment. In other words, if the group has a dozen handy talkies that they pass out and collect, he has to make sure that the batteries are charged and that they all work and that they're all programmed the same way and programmed to the right channel. So not a big thing, but something that has to be done. And on the side fact, a lot of people go out there and buy Baofeng radios. I am not a fan of Baofeng radios, but I understand they're cheap and a lot of people buy them. However, when you go into buying the Baofeng radio, make sure you know how to operate them. I've had a lot of people come up to me and say, I just bought this Baofeng radio. How do I use it? How do I set the frequency? And my comment really is, I don't know, because I don't use them. So in your group, make sure that whatever equipment you buy or whatever equipment your comm specialist buys, that you all know how to use it. That being said, all right. The next thing is you have to develop and implement the communications plan. It is a comm specialist's duty to set up and operate under a communications plan. And I'm going to do another video on this, but you have to develop the plan and you have to use it, and you have to develop it in concert with the crew leaders and with the members of the crew. In other words, an example I like to use is, if you have a crew and everybody's got their ham radio license, then it's pretty much a no-brainer that you'll probably use ham radio for your inter-crew or inter-family communications. However, if you are the only ham radio operator, then you may want to think of another way to communicate within the group. There's CB radio, FRS, GMRS, business radio. There's a lot of other ways, but you have to take that in consideration. And I'm going to do another video on the comms plan itself to help people understand how to do that. The comms specialist also has to provide comms links, and that's what we call it. We call it links or linkages, between members of the crew and their families, between nearby crews, and then also further away on a regional or national basis with either same crews like the Viking preparedness crews or other like-minded crews further out. And he has to be able to do that, and again, that takes skill and practice. The other thing the communication specialist does is they monitor communications infrastructure, and they adjust the comms as necessary. Now, what I mean by that is, in today's world, we have cell phones, text messaging, Facebook, Twitter, groups, forums, whatever, and you may use some of that in your day-to-day operations. However, the comm specialist needs to monitor that to make sure that they are still functioning. In today's world, we see censorship, we see banning, we see deplatforming, and while Facebook may be a great way for you to communicate amongst your crew and their families, Facebook might say, "We don't like you guys anymore, you are banned." Then what do? Again, you fall back to your communications plan, but the comms specialist should be kind of monitoring this stuff to make sure that everything's working like it's supposed to. The last thing you want to do is get surprised in an emergency. All right. He also provides training, communications training for crew members, and additional training for the radio telephone operators. As a comms specialist, as the comms sergeant, you're probably not going to be the guy that goes on patrol anymore. And again, when I talk about that balance of power or whatever, you are more than likely going to be the guy back at, we'll just call it HQ, and you're going to be the guy that monitors the radios and relays information back to the crew leaders on things that are happening out in the field. All right? So you're going to have RTOs, or radio telephone operators, and those are people that are going to have additional training over the rest of your crew. And you may have, depending on the size of your crew, you may not have any, or you may have one or two, but you want to have somebody that has, ideally you'd like to have everybody have as much skill as you, but the reality is that's probably not going to happen. So you get somebody and you raise their level of training a little bit more. Same thing like a medic. You have a doctor back at the base, but then you have medics out in the field, and the medics have more training than the average soldier, but not as much as a doctor. All right. You also have to develop knowledge and skills to operate under adverse conditions. And what I mean by that is, probably 95% of the time you can operate from your home, plugged into an outlet, talking on your very best antennas with your very best radios, and more than likely that's the way it's going to be for most of the time. However, that 5%, your crew may have to evacuate the area, and you may have to move to a more austere location where you don't have mains power, where you may not even have a generator, so you have to learn to operate under those conditions. Now you won't have your best antenna anymore, and so the conditions of your communications changes, and you have to learn to adapt to that, operating under field conditions, what I call portable or mobile operations. And then finally, the last thing you have to consider is you have to be able to run a local net, and what a net is a group of radio operators meeting on the same frequency at the same time, and typically there is one of those guys who is a net control. In other words, he controls the traffic between the various members of the net so that you have an efficient and functional net. Again, it takes skill and it takes practice. It's not, it's not necessarily that it's overly difficult, but it does take skill and it does take practice. And your amateur radio operator, your comm specialist, should be able to run a local net. That's of the nets, that's the easiest one to run. He should be able to. There's lots of ways to get training. I'll do a video that kind of talks about net operations a little bit later. But you need to be able to do that. And in addition, you must have the skills necessary to participate in a regional and or a national net. Again, it's very similar, but the rules change a little bit, and band conditions change a little bit, and so what may be real easy on your little VHF net gets pretty hard when you're on a regional or national HF net. And you got to have the skills. You have to understand how these nets operate, how they participate, some of the language they use. And again, that is something that you need to develop and practice. Waiting for things to go bad to start doing this is bad voodoo, and it's not going to help your team any. So I've kind of gone a little long. Tried to touch on a lot of little things. I do have a newsletter I put out on occasion, and it's mainly for a group of people for the Viking preparedness types. However, it is what it is. I will be posting more videos here on communications. I do want you guys to learn. I do want you guys to be able to communicate. It's often forgot about in today's world because we look at it from the aspect, I've got my cell phone, I've got my computer, I've got Facebook and Twitter and WhatsApp and all this other stuff and texting and all this other stuff. But that may go away because somebody else controls it. At least when you all have your own radios, you control that radio. So that's all I got for today. I hope this is informative. Again, more to follow. I try to break it up a little bit. This one went a little long, but understand the duties and then work towards getting those skills that you need. That's all I have. Stay safe, stay secure, and I hope to hear you out there. We'll see you.